Welcome back to the Boomerang 2D tutorial series. This time we're going to talk about HUD objects, bitmap fonts, and the Dialog content editor. Let's go ahead and jump right in. We're going to start by creating a bitmap font, and we're going to use this image to do that. Go to Tools, Boomerang 2D, Bitmap Font Editor to open the editor. We'll go ahead and create a new one. We'll call this tutorial font. The first thing that we do is import our bitmap font atlas, which is a normal PNG. We can make the image a little bit bigger using the zoom options. Our first property is the glyph height. This is how many pixels high each glyph will be. Let's add our first glyph. When we do, we see a pink box appear on top of the glyph. By clicking this button, we can choose which character the glyph will be associated with. We'll choose A. Every glyph will have the same height, but each can have their own width. Let's adjust the width so that the box fully contains the A. We can choose which row it will be in, which is defined by how high each glyph is. As I increase the row, you'll see that it automatically snaps to the next row. The X position is the start of our container for the glyph. Now that we've created the glyph for the A, we can add a second glyph. Because we have the option set for Predict Next Position, the X position of our second glyph will automatically start at the edge of the container for the previous glyph. And because we've chosen to predict next character, it will automatically choose the B because that comes right after the A. Here we will want to change our width again. You'll also notice that the width had defaulted to our default width. Here I know that most of these characters are 11 pixels wide, so I'll change our default width to 11 pixels. And I can choose to add a new glyph. Our default properties are already set up so that the C is automatically contained and is assigned to the C character. Our eye is a little less wide than the previous glyphs, so we can just change this. Now that we've reached the end of this row, we can increase our row by 1, change our X to 0, and when we add our next glyph, the next container will be on the second row. Now that I'm done assigning all of the glyphs in this font set, I can choose Save. And that's all there is to creating your own bitmap font. You'll see that we only have the capital letters A through Z and the lowercase letters A through Z. If we look at the font that comes with the demo content, we'll see that we have additional glyphs for the numbers, for some punctuation, and for some mathematical operations. Now let's take a look at the HUD Object Editor. We go to Tools, Boomerang 2D, HUD Object Editor. Let's create a new HUD object. We'll call this Tutorial HUD. On the right, we have 3 tabs: Properties, Elements, and Interaction Events. The only property that we have for our HUD object is which shader that we'd like to use for it. The next tab over are the elements. Let's add a new element. We'll see all of the elements that we've added to this HUD object listed here in this top box. The properties for this element are listed down here. For this example, let's use a graphic grid. You'll notice that when I changed which UI element we were using, the properties below it had all changed. These properties are dependent on the UI element. For the graphic grid, our first section is our position. Let's position this a little bit further from this corner. Now we have some grid properties. Let's say our items per row is 6. And we'll keep our spacing at 0 for now. This next section allows us to use either a static number for the value or use a game flag. We have one game flag for our player HP, which is set to 10. The current value is how many objects will appear in that grid. Let's set this to 14. And now we have 14 objects for our graphic grid with 0 spacing and 6 per row. Finally, we have the properties for our graphics. The first option is our tile set. We create these tile sets the same way that we do for the maps. Let's take a look at the demo UI tile set and the various stamps that come with it. For this tile set, I'll go ahead and use the demo UI. You'll see that I've chosen the blue box here, and we're only getting the top left corner of the blue box. You'll see that I can change my stamp size just like I can in the map editor, and that they'll scale the exact same way. We also have an active filled item stamp. The active flag is just the status that each UI element can have, and this is used for behavior. You'll see later when we look at interaction events that we can change the active status of any UI element, and in doing so we can change which stamp is being used to display that element. The next option down is a check that allows us to use an empty stamp. Here I'll use the stamp orange box. Here we can set our max value source, which again will be either a static number or a game flag float, and we can set our value. Here I'll set our value to 20. The max value for this graphic grid will be 20, and our current value is 14. So 14 of the 20 cells are using the blue box, and the remaining are using the orange box. We can see how this is used more effectively in the demo player HUD. Here we have one graphic grid for the hearts, and we're using the empty heart stamp for our max value, and then our full heart stamp for how many hearts the player currently has. Let's take a look at another element. This time I'm going to choose text box. Just like with our graphic grid, the text box has its own unique properties. We can choose a text source, and here we can choose the static text, which allows us to enter whatever text we want into here. We can use a game flag float, a game flag string, the value of a game flag boolean, or something from the content database. This allows us to define the length of the text, and then put zeros in the beginning of it to fill it out to that length. This is mostly used for elements that display how much currency or how many points your player has, and is typically used in conjunction with a game flag float. This allows us to choose the font that we want to use with the text, and we can use a different font if our element is active. We also have some options for word breaking, and here we can choose the spacing between characters and rows. Our next section allows us to choose the dimensions. We can set our width and our height to static values, or we can tell them to scale between a min value and a max value depending on the length of the text inside. And we also have some padding between the edge of the container and where the text starts. Again, we can choose a stamp and a tile set to define the properties of our graphics. You can see that our text is running outside of our box, and that's because we've set our height to be a static 3. Here we can choose a max height, say 10, and now when this renders in-game, the box will only be as high as it needs to without going over 10. However, for the purpose of the preview, we'll always see the max height of the element. We can also define a button prompt and set its properties. And finally, we have a preview option that allows us to see what it would look like with multiple rows of text. Let's take a look at our final editor. Let's go to Tools, Boomerang 2D, Dialog Content Editor. The Dialog Content Editor allows us to write text and store them separately and then use them within our HUD element. Let's take a look at one of the examples. The first column is our Dialog Content ID, which is a unique identifier for this row of content. Our next column is the speaker name, followed by the dialog text. We can also choose a graphic for our portrait using a tile set and then a tile from that tile set. For the demo content, we're using the tile set Demo Portraits. Let's take a look at the demo portraits. We have simple portraits for 2 NPC characters, and we could add more if we'd like. Our next column over are choices. For example, here you can see Start Game and View Controls. And finally, we have an option to delete this content item. Let's see how this works with our HUD Object Editor. Let's select our text box UI element and scroll down to where it says Text Properties. Here it's asking for a text source. And we're going to use the content database for our text source. Let's grab the Dialog Content ID and simply paste it right into here. And then we can choose which of these properties we'd like to use. We have our Dialog Content ID, the speaker name, and the text. Let's add a new element. We're going to choose the single graphic. Under graphic, we can choose our tile set and our stamp like we did before, or we can use this option that says uses content portrait. Here it'll ask for a content ID. I'll include demo NPC1. Then we have options for the graphic that will display only in this editor. The last element that we can look at is a choice box. This is the most complicated, but most of these properties we've already looked at before, and the ones that we haven't looked at are pretty self-explanatory. Finally, the last tab over are our interaction events. Let's add a new one here. HUD Object Interaction Events work the same way as they do for actors and for map regions. We can choose a trigger condition, and we can choose some events to play when these conditions are met. And that's everything you need to know about fonts, the HUD Object Editor, and the Dialog Content Editor. The only thing that we haven't covered yet is how to actually display your HUD. The first way to display your HUD is when you load a map. You'll remember that when we looked at the map editor in an earlier video, we had some events that would happen on load. The onload events for our demo forest include a display HUD object with the name of that HUD object loaded into the appropriate field. The other way is by way of an actor. The demo NPC dialog region actor has an interaction event set up for displaying a HUD object. Here we check if our player is overlapping this actor and our player's current state is idle, and then presses the X button. We'll display our dialog box HUD, and then we use the value of the content ID stat on this actor. Here you'll see that the actor stat is demo NPC1, and so it will use the demo NPC1 dialog content. Anywhere where you can invoke an event, whether it's through the map onload state, an actor interaction event, a state entry event, or a region event, you can have a HUD object appear. Thank you for following this tutorial, and we'll see you in the next one.